Monterey, California. We're here at 222 Central Avenue, which is the boyhood home of John Steinbeck. He lived here with his aunt and his mother and his sisters. We're going to meet Richard Anderson, the curator of the John Steinbeck Museum, and hear the story.
I want to invite you to come into our Steinbeck house. This is, of course, the Hamilton home. There are two sides of the family, the Hamilton and Steinbeck side. This is a statue that I did of Steinbeck. It's my humble creation, and I think John would appreciate it. Well, welcome to John Steinbeck's family home. This was a home that the grandmother died in. It might be interesting to know that Grandpa just walked away one day and disappeared. It's kind of an interesting paradox in the life of John Steinbeck. But he would be living in this house when he was about well, 8, 9, 10. Pacific Grove was a summer residence. It was founded by the Chautauquans. There was a gate around the town. You had to be in by 8 and out by 8. If you weren't, you were locked in or locked out. Across the street, Judge Langford lived, and I used to talk to his niece about the times when John was here. The saying was that one time he was hung over, and they had to come down and open up the gate, and he said, "I've had enough of this," and he knocked it down, and that was the end of the gate. That's why it's called the Gatehouse Inn across the street. And it's a marvelous thing. Get a chance, you must go over there and see it. At any rate, when John Steinbeck was living in this house during the summers, because Dad was a tax assessor and a treasurer, and he was working over in Salinas, sometimes he'd come over on the weekend. That was quite a jaunt at that time. You take it for granted you can move in a car today, but there was nothing like that at that time. As a matter of fact, at one time it was horse and carriage. Anyway, when John was in this house, he'd be living with the mother, the grandmother, 3 sisters, and an Aunt Molly that lived behind. She'd married a wealthy rancher. They'd been divorced, and so she lived over here. And he'd be living with the overpowering femininity, because they were all big girls and pretty damn powerful. So, being the only boy, he'd be a little bit intimidated by that, by his friends seeing him in that house. And he had the tendency to go down to Cannery Row and addle up to the stevedores, the fishermen, the ladies of the night, the truck drivers. And then he could come home a little dirty, maybe even have a little sip of beer, and remind the ladies at the supper table he'd been accepted by the most macho men in the world. That gave him parity with them. I point this out because I don't know if you know, Hemingway was kept in girls' clothing when he was 16. Mom wanted a girl. You can see the reflection in his writing, an overcompensatory desire to get over that and prove his masculinity. Another thing, when we're living in this Victorian era, remember that during that time over in England, admirals, generals, statesmen were raised by nannies. And you can see when a person's raised by a nanny, a completely different emotional complexion. But here Steinbeck is trying to assert himself in this overpowering feminine environment, and I want to point that out. And he's quite successful until Mother asked him one day, because she's a school teacher and an artist, she looks at the report card, it's absolutely terrible. "John, what's going on here?" And he says, "Well, Mom, the guys down there say reading and writing's for sissies." Well, she knows right away what that means. However, the idea is to redirect that energy without scratching that delicate male ego. So they have a plan. And what she will do is take John and little Mary. Now this is Mary Decker, and she plays a role in The Red Pony, which is one of his books. There she is sitting on the pony with John. They'll take Mary and John who just idealized him, being the youngest one. She just looked up to him like a saint. And took him up to San Francisco, to the art museum, to a gallery, to a symphony, to a ballet, and of course to a library. And showed him there's a whole world out there, not just this little provincial community. There's San Francisco, there's Berlin, there's Paris, there's Rome, and give him more cosmopolitan perspective. And then, on the 10th birthday, they do the most dynamic thing of all. And if you read the biography, you'll see where Jackson Benson and Mr. Perini, who has a dubious basis for his writing, will say that no single book, no single experience inspired John Steinbeck more to be a writer than his reception of this book called Mort d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory. And of course, in it are Beardsley's illustrations, which are quite phenomenal. Mr. Beardsley did all of these illustrations in it, and this is a second edition. But when John Steinbeck is walked through this in Middle English, it will be so exciting. He'll say, well, it's like deja vu, like from another life. Now I know what I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be Sir Lancelot, not with the gun or the sword, but with the pen. Take my people back to Camelot, the unreachable star, the unreachable dream. Maybe Don Quixote, the unreachable star, the unreachable dream, or King Arthur, or maybe I can achieve the holy grail of literature. And I want to say to you that that is his aspiration. Now, we're in this room, you see the sword and the stone, you can see the knight in armor and the shield and what have you, and I will begin to show you how this young boy's dream and aspiration matures and manifests, and how he leaves us a legacy in literature, which I think is incredible. I got the place, this was a desk that John Steinbeck actually used. I had to replace this part up here, and the sides of it was all rotted away. I retained this part and the other part, and this is a chair it's rumored that he did use. This is an actual typewriter that he did use at Stanford University. Now, he abandoned the typewriter as a dehumanizing, desexualizing instrument. I wonder what you think of the computer. He did everything in a delicate long hand. Here are examples. Now, his father would have these huge piles of this paper, which was yellow and lined, on his desk. And John Steinbeck would get these pads from his dad free. Now, when he is about 29 in the center of our country, moving along quite rapidly, as we all know, in the center of our country, in Oklahoma, Kansas, Arkansas, in the center of our country, these people here will lose everything they have. It will all turn to dust. Just imagine that. And they'll come out here to California with their few possessions. They'll come down Route 66. And when they do, the National Guard's going to meet them. Say, we have no room for you. Look at all the people who are here now. And they're camped out there, defecating alongside the highway where people are driving in their Cadillacs and Lincolns, going to see Hollywood and Beverly Hills. And they become an embarrassment, so much so the governor decides he's going to shift them away to the San Joaquin Valley and hope they'll just drift away. Well, they don't. There they are, out in their privation once again, being treated worse than the Braceros. So he'll call up, of all people, John Steinbeck, who's now a budding writer, and he'll ask John, would you come along and maybe we can help these people. Your writing is so inspiring, maybe we can reach them. So John comes along and he sees them. They could be his mother, his father, his aunt, his uncle. They're blood, they're kin. His heart goes out to them. It's a firm identification. So much so now he'll get an old truck which was called the Pie Factory. And he'll go around knocking on doors. Do you have any food, any clothing, anything at all to spare? And he'll pass it out to them, and by candlelight at night he'll write a story to go with the photographs. Well, it's sent to New York. They receive it, and they look at it, and they say, gee, these photographs are great. But who the hell wrote this stuff? We could make a bad situation worse. The Second World War was coming on, the Great Depression. They canned it. I tried desperately many times to find out what the hell happened to it, but it's gone. Anyway, when John Steinbeck finds out that that has happened, he says to Carol, his first wife, and here's a photograph up here. Let's remember, Carol went to Berkeley, and she was a very sophisticated woman who came down to English literature. She had a little relationship with Mr. Saroyan and different people, but she has been a nice compliment for John, and they're married already. And he's going to say to her, Carol, they don't give a damn about these people. I'm going to write a book and shake this country up and call attention to their plight. And what a book it's going to be, The Grapes of Wrath, as we all know. Now, when that book comes out, it's going to be touch and go as how it's going to be accepted. But there's always a woman in the right place at the right time. This time it's Eleanor Roosevelt, Hillary's heroine. And she goes on national radio and says, he's a genius. How lucky we are to have a young man come out of California, of all places, and show us the compassion, understanding we must have for each other at this time. And he becomes an overnight literary success, a national figure. You might even say an international figure. But now the paradox happens, which is almost unbelievable. The people here, watching what's happening, suddenly turn and say, well, that's it, you little dirty son of a, so on. You're going to make yourself famous at our expense, make money at our expense. You're going to expose us as Christian hypocrites who didn't share the loaf of bread and the fish, bankers who didn't give them a dime, and if we did charge them 50% interest on their money, treat them worse than the braceros. Get out of here. Well, they wouldn't allow his books in the library in Salinas, but that's only the beginning. They burnt copies in the street. Girls from the right side of the tracks had to go in the old wrong neighborhoods to even get a copy. And then they were going to set him up with a girl in a hotel room. She's going to yell rape and put him in prison for that. Finally, the sheriff, a very provincial man here, will come and say, well, John, I don't know what you did here, but if you don't leave town, they're going to kill you. And they would have. And John Steinbeck is going to leave our community, and the rest of his life when he comes back, he's warned to be apprehensive that somebody might hurt him. And if you meet the old-timers, just ask them about John Steinbeck. Nobel Prize, Pulitzer Prize, come here. Let me tell you about that good-for-nothing, dirty son of a bitch. And it still goes on to this day. And when John goes up to Los Gatos, where he's going to live now, he'll be down in L.A. one time, and he's going to meet this beautiful girl, Gwendolyn Congers. In fact, there's another picture of her up there in her profile. We can get to that later on. Gwendolyn Congers was singing with a band. Now, she's completely different than his first wife. Remember I told you he went to Berkeley, English literature and what have you, potential writer herself? Gwendolyn Congers has stars in her eyes. She can see her taking the place of Jean Harlow or one of these blonde, torrid types. And that's her idea. Meeting John Steinbeck, he could be the catalyst to that happening. But she's going to give him 2 children, John Jr. and Tommy. And they're going to be married, and John is very enthralled, but it's a very torrid relationship, very sexual. There is some drinking and what have you involved. I think that's marginal. But John had an inferiority complex about his appearance. He thought he had big ears and thought he was kind of ugly. I don't think he's that bad looking. But he had to go over to Europe to be a foreign correspondent. He's over there with Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who I spent time here with. And by the time he comes back, the marriage is in trouble. She's going to sue for divorce. And what a divorce this is going to be. Her and her mother are going to torture him the rest of his life. And I can't make that too emphatic. Just now we had a biography on national television, and they brought up the fact that she'd remind him again and again that John Jr. wasn't even his son. To taunt him, you know. And so he's going to come out of this broken marriage that's been so indigenous to so many of our lives in our time. And he's going to be staying over at the Pine Inn. Now the Pine Inn is a very glorious, beautiful bed and breakfast. And he's over there, and he's very restless, as he always was at night, and he gets up and he's smoking a cigarette in the hall. Now, unbeknown to him, a woman has come here with Ann Southern. Her name is Elaine Scott. Some of you remember Zachary Scott was a motion picture actor. His career's in trouble. He's been gambling, drinking, and he had Shakespearean aspirations. He's in Hollywood, but he's in big trouble. Maybe she came here looking for someone else. I'm not going to say that. She's had one daughter, and the daughter's name is Waverly. Now, she gets up in the same evening, restless, walks in the hall, and they bump into each other. Hi, how are you? You know, well, I'm all right, you know. And they begin having a conversation. And the first thing, you know, how'd you like to have lunch with me tomorrow? Well, I'd be so flattered. Are you really John Steinbeck? Yeah. Anyway, they have lunch together the next day together, the three of them. And now he falls madly in love. And he will continue to have this romance with her at Joan Crawford and Douglas Fairbanks' home. Rather a secret tryst that goes on for quite some time. Then she's going to divorce her husband and marry John Steinbeck. But now, from the mythology of King Arthur, Elaine and Lancelot are together. This has been like his dream. He's always envisioned this possibility happening, and it's almost like this idea of the Grail is coming true. Now, at that particular moment, we'll divide the two people. Elaine had the idea that she was a motion picture producer. She would never make it in the movies. However, she was quite attractive. She came from Texas. So she'll get John Steinbeck to rewrite Cannery Row as a musical called Pipe Dream. And her idea is to produce and direct it. She'll get in touch with Rodgers and Hammerstein, all the big people, because of his name and power. And the idea is to make it a success as a musical on Broadway. Well, it goes to Philadelphia, it plays for about 7 days, goes to Broadway, and it bombs. It's a turkey. That's a matter of record. You don't hear much about it. But now, John Steinbeck, at this particular moment, will make these statements, and I quote him directly. All of this writing, everything I do, everything I will ever do, is peripheral to one single book, one single idea, one single message. And that's going to come in his magnum opus, East of Eden. Now, people are going to say that's a flawed book, they're going to criticize it and so on, but I'm going to show you how they continue to criticize Steinbeck even to this day, and how even to this moment, people don't really appreciate what this man is. And when I start saying he's a spiritual man, come on, Richard, you know what John Steinbeck is. Well, I'm going to try to prove it to you today. Now, he's going to carve a box out of a piece of olive wood his great-grandfather brought back from Jerusalem. And his great-grandfather was called to go to Jerusalem one time by God himself. And he disbanded his home, gave up everything he had, and in 2 covered wagons, they went to Jerusalem, and he began preaching the New Testament. When we talk about Kosovo today, remember, those were the Ottoman Turks, and Jerusalem was under control at that time. And when he was there, after a year of preaching, his brother was murdered. And he went back up to Gethsemane and said, how do I go on? Well, he went on. Now, the next thing that happens is that Melville, who was quite a writer, his son will commit suicide, and Melville will go to Jerusalem to try to find his roots and what had gone on. He will meet John Steinbeck's great-grandfather there, which I think is really something quite interesting, because Melville was an incredible writer. But however now, he goes on with it, and his wife will be beaten and raped. How can I go on? And his money is wanting. He doesn't have very much working that ground. And so he goes up to Gethsemane this time and says, God, I can't go on. Can't you give me a sign so I know what to do next? And they say that it thundered and the lightning struck the olive tree there and knocked a piece of the olive wood down. And the father saw that as a sign. This is, my mission is complete here. He puts the olive wood in the covered wagon, goes back to Dusseldorf. Then they come across through Maine, Virginia, down through Florida, across to Missouri, and out to California. That's the piece of olive wood that he carved that box from. Now, as we're moving along, even today, fathers are warned, if you have 2 brothers and they're very close, don't favor one over the other. In case of your death, they could fight and quarrel over the money involved, and jealousy and hatred could ensue that'd be destructive to what you left and to your children. Well, of course, that takes into Cain and Abel. Don't forget, when we talk about our Civil War, hundreds of thousands of brothers killed their own brothers. And that was not too distant in the minds of people when John Steinbeck was born in the Salinas Valley in the Gabilan Hills. And he remembered that very distinctly. And he remembered also about his own 2 boys, John and Tom, and the broken marriage. So now he's going to write a book that goes back to the Civil War's roots. And he notices in bibliography, especially when we go to Hebrew lexicography, in the Hebrew, Cain, who killed his own brother, God speaks to him and says, "Thou mayest yet rule over sin," Cain. Killed his own brother. And God gives him this opportunity. Well, why shouldn't it be like that for all of us? The King James Bible says, "Thou shalt, thou must." And that's it, no bones about it. But Steinbeck says, no, it should be "thou mayest." That will change the origin of Genesis from linear to cyclical and give us freedom of choice and the chance to extricate ourselves from this indomitable idea of sin and evil. Isn't that only fair? So now in 1,000 pages in handwritten form, he is going to complete this manuscript, put it gently into this box, and call forward his two sons, John, Tom, this is Dad's gift to you. If you can understand this book, it's going to protect you from what I see coming. Just imagine that. And so the two boys, with Dad, take it to Pasquale Covici. Pasquale Covici is his publisher at that particular time. And Covici knew he was a genius a long time ago. And every time John Steinbeck wrote, he took a radical new approach. These are not just books to him. This was an autobiographical attempt to reach the Holy Grail. And I can say that and mean it and know I'm talking the truth. Now, Covici looks at the text, sees that he's trying to change the interpretation of the commandments. He goes first to a priest and a minister. Then the highest rabbinical authority in our country at that time, Dr. Rabbi Ginsburg in Brooklyn, New York. And he approaches him and says, "You know, I represent a genius of a writer. Maybe you heard of him, John." "Oh, yeah, I got heard of him, yeah." He said, "Well, he wants this time to change the interpretation of the commandments ever so slightly. Can he do that?" "No," he says. Evangelical, Pentecostal, fundamentalist, Calvinistic preachers, they're going to give him a hard time on that. It could ruin his writing career. And I'll tell you something else. One of them might even hurt him. Go back and tell him to change it. So he's going to come back to John Steinbeck, and he knows John's temper and so on, but he says very gently, "Look, John, I know what you're trying to do with this book, and very powerful, but you've got to change it." "Change it? What are you talking about? Calamity pounds of death. I'm going to change. This is my whole life, everything I've worked for. I'm not going to compromise myself now." Impossible. I mean, he really is adamant about this. Well, Covici backs off. He knows how he is. Stamps out of the room. He stamps out of the room. And for 3 months, this argumentation is going to go on. And they could have become enemies over this book. That's how important it was. However, he had alimony to pay, child support, a firm contract, and it's John that's going to call Covici back and say, "All right, damn it, that's what you want. I'll change it." He changed 92,000 words, 400 pages, against his will. The original manuscript and the box are down at the University of Texas in Austin, under the jurisdiction of Pasquale Covici Jr., who's on the faculty, and of course Mrs. Steinbeck and a few other people, and it just sits there. Now incidentally, let's remember that this is the actual book that he was given at the age of 10 to inspire him to do all of this. It's in Chaucerian English. Geoffrey Chaucer is the father of our language. It is Gaelic, it is German, English, Welsh, French, all combined in a commonly denominative language and brought forward in this particular book. John Steinbeck says, well, what if my son Tom or John tries to forward through that? They're not that familiar with Middle English. They won't be able to get the same inspiration that I did. They won't understand what I'm trying to do in East of Eden. Someone's got to translate it into the American language. Well, who the hell do you think is going to have to do it? There's only one man, John Steinbeck. Now, that's going to be a prodigious thing to do. He talked to Chase Horton in the Village and to Elizabeth Otis with the company that controls the estate. And they tried gently to talk him out of it. You can see this welling up inside of him. They want him to write another play, another movie. They've got all kinds of ideas for him. Where's the money going to come from this? What's this all about? However, he picks up a newspaper, and in the newspaper, after he's been probing this particular document, and I'm going to take the book up and show you how phenomenal John Steinbeck's mind is and was. As he's thumbing through this text, he says, you know, something's wrong. I know Mallory's style, but there are breaks and inconsistencies in this text. When he was in prison and the king gave him every book he wanted, the gentleman used to go over and take the transcripts through the bars. He said he must have taken those transcripts and edified some of them on his own. And there must be another document somewhere. This was Mr. Caxton who did that. He's the one who published this. He said Caxton must have secreted something away somewhere when he edified it. There must be some other documentation. Well, the newspaper states that they have dug a little deeper in the tomb where Arthur and Guinevere were buried. And they found it, the Winchester manuscript. It is a contradiction in form of this original that he has. There it is, he says. And Dr. Eugene Vennebeer, who has a doctorate in English, is commissioned by Oxford University to do the translation, and John says, we're going to England. So he takes Elaine to a place called Bruton in Somerset, and if you can pan back on that particular thing here, you'll see me in the cottage. Now this is near Glastonbury Tor, and this cottage in Bruton, when I went there, I tried to get admission to go in, and the lady said, can you imagine if we let everybody in here that comes here? It'd be impossible. I said, well look, I came from Pacific Grove, John Steinbeck's hometown. Is there any chance I could? Well, I'm going to go back and talk to this gentleman, and if he says it's all right, I'll let you in. I met him and I talked to him, and he let me in, and I went in the room, the old kitchen, I went upstairs, and from the top window in the bedroom, you can see Glastonbury Tor, near Warwick Castle, and it was just enthralling for me to be there. Now this was not just any cottage. He had researched this in the original Doomsday Book, and found that this cottage was in the original Doomsday Book by Edward the Confessor. Now for about 3 years, off and on, he'll go to the Vatican Library to get the transcripts of Mallory's original trial, Germany, France, Ireland, tramping all over the countryside, libraries, with the Duke of Northumberland's most classic library in England, to try to unearth every little detail so that every vowel and consonant is correct. This is going to be a masterpiece, or it's never going to see the light of day, I quote John Steinbeck. Now John has already had one mild heart attack, but here he's going to have the second heart attack, and when he does, it's not that bad, but a man must question his mortality. How much time and strength does he have? How much can he accomplish before his time comes? And after talking to Elaine and talking to the people back in New York, they finally dissuade him and say, look, John, why don't you come back to New York, take it easy, kind of rest, and you can do it in your spare time. Now he comes back to America, and when he comes back, those hounds on the East Coast are always been waiting for him. John Steinbeck was never accepted by Yale, Princeton, Harvard, and those sophisticated people. Even today, you'll see that they say about the Californians, send your kids to school out there and you'll see what you get. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. Stanford has tried to offset that by keeping a pretty high standard for academics, but at that particular time they begin tearing into Steinbeck and saying, well, he couldn't write about our country, what the hell does he know? He had a lucky break when he wrote Grapes of Wrath and those other books. He's out of touch. He can't really, he's lost the pulse of America. Well, John Steinbeck's going to show them. If you can imagine, he's going to ask for an RV, which he gets, and he's going to name it Reciante, after Don Quixote's horse. He's going to talk to his wife, Elaine, and say, Elaine, can I take the big French poodle, Charlie? Well, sure, John, you can take him. You know, he'll keep you company, you know. And so he calls Charlie a new name, Sancho Panzas. And now, Don Quixote and Sancho Panzas are going to travel 3,000 miles across our country, each way, to talk to farmers, teachers, stockbrokers, radio station operators, truck drivers, people from all walks of life. Hello, I'm John Steinbeck. How's it going while you're having a cup of coffee? What's happening? To recapture the pulse of our country. And he does, and he comes back, and a beautiful book out of that comes Travels with Charlie, which really is something. But that was the real motivation behind it. However, still they're coming after him. They're just not going to rest with this guy. But now, at an intermediary point, Mr. Johnson is going to inherit the White House after the Kennedy assassination. Prior to the Kennedy assassination, a lot of people don't know, John Steinbeck was asked by Jack Kennedy to go to Russia to try to change the first citizen diplomat, long before anything at perestroika ever developed. And that's not remembered by too many people. And he's coming through Warsaw on the way back with Edward Albee, who wrote Virginia Woolf, because he decided to take him with him. In fact, Edward Albee was on the television just the other day commenting a little bit about this. In Warsaw, they hear that he's been assassinated. And of course, it was a terrible thing for all of us. And the outpouring of flowers, even in the East, was just unbelievable. He wrote about 3 or 4 different letters of comfort to Jacqueline Kennedy, which are really something if you ever have a chance to read them in the Life and Letters, trying to help her with her grief and talking about how great this man was. And remember, the Jack Kennedy administration was called Camelot, the King Arthur idea. Merlin, all of that was embodied in it. And of course, now he was going to do the biography of, prior to that time, the potential biography of John F. Kennedy. But all that dwindled away, and now Johnson's in the White House. Now an irony is going to take place here. When Johnson is in the White House, his wife, Lady Bird, had gone to school with Elaine Scott and John Conley, who's in the car. After he becomes president, it won't be long before Johnson wants to pull it out. Remember the Gulf of Tonkin? And he says to Elaine and to Lady Bird, come on, you can talk him into it. What? Let's get him to go to Vietnam and moralize the war. His 2 sons are serving there. John, I think, had a little problem with drugs. He may have got him exonerated. But at any rate, John Steinbeck is going to go to Vietnam and tromp through the rice paddies, patting the boys on the back and moralizing that ugly, dirty war. People come out of the woodwork. How could John Steinbeck, of all people, do that? The man who wrote Grapes of Wrath, the man who made Dubious Battle, who had such compassion for the common man. Because, you know, the tempers ran high in that Vietnam War. Well, he did it. And I'm going to defend him. His sons were serving there. His president asked him to go. His wife had gone to school with Lady Bird. He was given the Medal of Freedom. But when he came back, he was never the same. Who was? That had ripped right through him and impaled him like it impaled so many different men. Now, he has been quite exhausted from the writing. After East of Eden, as a matter of fact, he makes the statement that East of Eden is almost my last book. There may be other writing. But East of Eden says it all. There's nothing more to say. When John Steinbeck was 17 years of age, he developed double pneumonia, and he was in the Catholic Dominican hospital in Salinas. They were about to give him the last rites. Suddenly, a young Catholic nun was at the hospital, and she began crying. And as she cried, she said, "Please, let me stay beside him and pray. I know I can save him." So for 7 days and 7 nights, she prayed beside him, and he made a miraculous recovery. He went home. And you know that piece of olive wood I was talking to you about that the great-grandfather brought back from Jerusalem? This time he went to it, and he carved off a piece of the olive wood and began carving a beautiful little Celtic cross. And when he finished that Celtic cross, he took it to her, and he said, "You know, I'm going to be a great writer someday, thanks to you. Would you take this little cross and remember me by it?" How do you show your compassion to a Catholic nun? Well, she was just overwhelmed by it. He carved 23 of those in his lifetime. I have a photograph of one of them. I believe that Mrs. Ainsworth's daughter still has one of them. I would like to have one in the museum if it were at all possible, because to me it was so important, so symbolic. So my son and I, in 1980, went down the Pacific Ocean, and these are 4 huge stones that have been shaped by the ocean. I drilled them and mounted them, and they're perfectly balanced and aligned to the constellation of Orion. I went to Newgrange in Ireland and took that off of an old Celtic tomb. It's a zoomorphic frieze. Remember, John Steinbeck's great-grandparents on the Irish side are from the northern counties, and that's one of the places that I took that from. Down below there was this edifice, and I put this on top of it. And this is dedicated to John Steinbeck's carving Celtic crosses on behalf of my son David and myself. Now my son just passed away. I intend to put his ashes here, and I intend to have a bronze mounted here talking about what I just told you. And of course it's very touching for me. So when people come by, they're going to see that. And it'll be there for perpetuity. I'm very proud of it. Now, there's a story about one particular book, I believe it's The Red Pony, or Sweet Thursday, and he wrote the entire thing in longhand, as he usually did, and then he gave it to this woman to type up for him. Now, she had 3 or 4 children and a very old player piano, and put it up on top of the piano, and the story is that it fell behind the piano and she lost it. She saw it all over. Finally, she had to call John. Oh, John, I've lost it. What are we going to do? That's all right, I'll write it all over again. So he wrote the whole damn thing over again. But don't you lose it this time. You get it typed up, we're sending it on to New York. So she diligently typed it up, and they sent it to New York and became another one of his famous books. The story is that about 3 or 4 years later, this time she was really cleaning the house and moved the piano and found the original. What? And they compared the two, and there were only 18 words different. He had all of this in that big head of his. It's a way of demonstrating to you that this was actually an old bard. In the old Druid world, they have these living bards who are living books. Sometimes they were blind. John Steinbeck, when I say he's Homer reborn, is just a bard to me. And in the old world, there'd be the dancing, singing, and the celebrations. This would go on for several days. And then, when the moon was full, in the final hours before they were going to go back to the fields and go back to their work, out would come the big bard. Gleaming white hair, his piercing eyes. And he'd go over all of the stories of the past and poetically, in his storytelling, revivify them, make them come back to life. They could feel it. And he'd realign them with the sun, the moon, and the stars. And when they went back out to their work and their planting, they were inspired. They knew that every single one of them was part of a composite idea. They were not alone. Everyone was a part of a community that was working towards fulfilling and keeping alive a spiritual heritage. Well, if you're alive and you read John Steinbeck, he makes you feel that way. He makes you know that you're part of that composite importance. And the first book that I think really signifies this is To a God Unknown. Read that book. And if that doesn't set you on fire, how he goes back up to Big Sur and the navel of the earth, that stone, and starts to reassert these ideas about the trees and the phallic quality of our community, and how you can see him working towards this. However, suddenly, out of nowhere, he is going to write a book called The Winter of Our Discontent. Now, Richard Nixon is our president at that time. And this is patterned after Richard Nixon through Richard III. Remember Richard III with the twins in the tower? And he'll do anything to get power. Anything. Well, that's what this title is about. And so, in The Winter of Our Discontent, he begins observing our society. The $64,000 question has been exposed as a fraud. And he looks around and he sees the corruption, the perversion creeping into society. The Vietnam War is over. He's had all these experiences. And he begins saying in this book, if you can really hear him, and there's a man called Cooperman who wrote a phenomenal assessment of John Steinbeck, who since died. And he's probing into the I Ching, the tarot deck. experimenting with astrology, all these different ideas, as though somehow, shamanistically within himself, he could well up that power or that ability to contend with what was happening to the American man. Now apparently, the Queen and King of Sweden paid attention to that. And they gave him the Nobel Prize for this book. Now you're going to hear that he got it for The Grapes of Wrath, East of Eden, and all of his writing. But this was the book that provocated the King and Queen of Sweden to give him the Nobel Prize for Literature. And it's a scathing denunciation of where we are going, perhaps where we are now, and where we may be going tomorrow. I want to call that to your attention. Now this man only made 2 personal appearances. This will be his second public appearance. He never even talked on the telephone. He was so shy. That's a matter of fact. But when he got alone with that pen in hand, he was a giant. And he comes and he makes a magnificent speech, acceptance speech for this prize, and comes back to New York City, and again, those hounds won't stop. John Steinbeck, getting that prize, why, good God, the Nobel Prize for Literature to that bum, that nothing, you know, they just won't let him alone. The critics were the same way with John Steinbeck. They always tried to parallel him into a defamatory position, just another writer. He didn't have the academic background, he didn't have this, he didn't have that. Well, I tried to call attention to people, in fact, that when he was at Stanford University, his teacher was Edith Merrily. She taught creative writing. And that was the 3rd experience he had with Stanford. And one day he turned to Edith and he said, "Edith, I'm going to leave here this time. I'm not coming back." And she said, "What's wrong, John?" "They don't want to teach me a damn thing. What they want to do is talk me out of what I have to do." And she said as he went away, "He's going to be a hell of a writer. Boy, that guy knows what he's all about." And he did. He walked away. Well, at the present time, as you may know, I am working with different people to raise the funds for a graduate fellowship at Stanford University in his honor. And it should be there. The greatest collection of Steinbeck material perhaps in the world is at the Green Library. And Mr. Packard bought that manuscript and paid $250,000, it's a matter of record, the owner of the Hewlett-Packard Corporation, Julie's father. He had Elaine come out here, and the 2 of them were at the Green Library where they presented it to Stanford University. It's up there. And let's remember about this property down here. That was the Chinese village. And when it burned down, there were people out there cheering as they took the corpses away. Cheering. Because they put the Chinese out of competition for the fishing industry. Then later on, they offered the property to Berkeley. And Berkeley said, well, it was too far away, they couldn't do something with it. Stanford decided to take advantage of that and took that property. Then taught undergraduate English at first. Later marine biology. And when John Steinbeck attended that, they taught undergraduate English and marine biology. That's why we find this unusual composition of intelligence and spiritual ecology involved. So that property belonging to Stanford, I think they owe it to our community, to our country, and that's what universities are really all about, to integrate themselves into the community and teach creative writing at the Stanford Marine Hopkins Station in John Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts and Joseph Campbell's honor. And of course, Ed Ricketts would have been the greatest marine biologist of all time. His book, Between Pacific Tides, is still the outstanding reference book on marine biology at this moment. John met him at a dental office, and they were the closest of friends. And when he died, it was like he lost his own brother. Ed Ricketts and John Steinbeck were so close, it's almost unbelievable. There's another interesting story. When the lab burned down, John Steinbeck called up on the telephone and said, don't touch a thing. I want everything to stay the way it is. He came to the lab and he took out every photograph, every document, and burned it in the fire. He practiced some of these occult principles I'm not going to be judgmental about that, but that's an interesting thing in itself. And we're getting towards the end of his life, but he's going to ask friends of his who are photographers to give him photographs of the country that he loves so deeply. Now, as you'll thumb through this book, you will see the photographs that he selected. And they're a panorama of our country and its people. Notice in the center, he has chosen a photograph of Charlton Heston playing the role of Moses in a drive-in theater. That's his last shot at "thou shalt, thou must," instead of "thou mayest." And I'll never forget the first time I opened that up, I just couldn't believe it. But he had his own little way of getting his points across. Now he's going to have the third heart attack, and when he does, his body is going to be taken to St. James Episcopal Church in Manhattan. Henry Fonda, who played the part of Tom Joad, is personally to come to the church and read in a touching manner from Ulysses by Tennyson. He was Ulysses. More than Ulysses, he was the author of the damn thing. He was Homer reborn. That's what I constantly say. Then his body, at his own personal request, will be cremated. And his ashes will be put into a beautiful little silver box and brought out here to California. And Elaine, his third wife, the two boys, John and Tom, will take his ashes to Point Lobos and throw them there. Now that was confirmed on national television by Mrs. Steinbeck. They say there's a marked grave in Salinas. If there is, there are some of those ashes in the grave. And I'm not going to debate that. And for religious propensities and purposes for other people of other denominations, that's why I think it was done. But now he's gone, and there's nothing on the King Arthur subject. I remember it to this day, because I followed his life so closely. And I said to myself, my God, is nothing ever going to come of it? As I heard that Mrs. Steinbeck was selling his magnificent library in medieval history and what have you. But apparently, they say that she was, on the second Christmas Eve after his death at night, reading the transcripts of where Elaine and Lancelot meet in the halls of Camelot. Only she would know. Serendipitously, he writes in their original meeting at the Pine Inn. She's touched, she cries, and she calls Mackintosh a notice and said, "You're going to think I've gone mad." But he keeps coming to me. "Publish it, publish it." I'll never rest. So she says, "We're going to take money from the estate in an unprecedented way and publish an incomplete book." And here it is, The Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights by John Steinbeck. Posthumously published. And the part of it which was accomplished is in here, and the letters he wrote to people about its importance. Now I have a friend, and his name is David Carpel, a very wealthy man, and he has the Carpel Library in Montecito, and he has the actual original manuscript in his possession. And he's invited me anytime I want to have people down there and would have a look at the manuscript, which I've had, and I've touched it already. I've tried to show you how a young boy had a dream and went on chasing that dream in variant ways. For instance, like in Tortilla Flat, he said, "You know, I still can't understand why people can't see what I'm doing. That I'm taking the Chicanos, the Italians, the Portuguese, and the different people of different religious denominations and creating a new round table, bringing them all together in kind of an ecumenical idea, and having them fend off the dehumanization, the desexualization which is going on." And today, you know, for the young people, I often say their heroes are animatronic, robotic, myopic, catatonic, Batman, Superman, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck. Well, they're not real. Yeah. And in the digitized world, which is binary, we don't provoke the imagination. We just bypass it. Well, this was a great man that tried so hard. And I tell you, if you take a look at him, and understand him. And people are coming from Japan, China, Russia, Germany, all over the world, just to touch and feel something that belongs to him. And that's because of the fact that the spirituality was going on inside him. They come down to Cannery Row, they can't believe it. They can't believe that the community would not pay that much attention to him. And they're dumbfounded. Well, I hope when they come in here, and they come into this house, and they meet me, that I'm going to fulfill that in my manner of speech and by my rationalization of what Mr. Steinbeck is. Because I want them to remember that the Christ figure did his ministry with the broken, the blind, the criminal, the insane, the twisted, the malformed. And this man came down from upper middle class, and by the fluke of events, he spent his time with those people and was happy to be with them. Read Cannery Row. And developed this camaraderie as though he could bring them back to something they had lost. And right now, as I see our country, what will it be? Will we go forward in a militant, mercantile way, with all of our power, telling everyone, thou shalt, thou must, or else? Or will we be content to use that as a mirror of our own example? Knowing that if we truly fulfilled that image of Christ that we talk so much about, people couldn't help but follow our example. And that's what Steinbeck said in this book, the last book he wrote. And this treatise in this book is all about that. Do we realize what it is to be born an American? That all races, creeds, and colors have come from all over the world here with equal opportunity. Our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, our Bill of Rights, these incredible documents, this incredible heritage, if we can't find the answer, our men and women, God help us. But I will never give up. I'll always dream and believe that it can be done. And they called him a communist when he knew Harry Bridges. They called him an un-American. And even when I'm going up to Stanford, I can feel that they think at the Hoover Pavilion that he's not far right enough for them. Well, how far is far right? He believed in the end in divine monarchy. That's what Christ represents. That's what real hope is. That's what the Holy Grail is. And the divine monarchy is what he's after in the end. And we all have clay feet in our beginning. He who is without guilt, let him throw the first stone. But I'll tell you something. When this man wrote, he left us a legacy and a heritage that every American can be proud of. And I only hope and pray that I can do justice to him. In the Indian lore, when a great chieftain dies for maybe a year, all of the braves will compete. Who is going to get the responsibility and the heritage of the soul of the great chieftain? There was only one thing I ever wanted in this life, to represent the soul of the great Celtic chieftain, John Steinbeck. And if I have it, I struggled for it, I desired it more than anything in this world. And I'm so proud to be here before you today, talking about John Steinbeck and talking about men like him. Because I don't think men really in the end can accomplish a thing without women giving us the rites of passage. And I mean what I'm saying. That's romantic love, where the two of them, like Tristan and Isolde, and realize what they call the Liebetod. And one man said to me one day, I'm going to close on this, Richard, remember, there are men that get property, money, degrees, power of all kinds, and get carried away with themselves. Egotistical, vain, egocentric, blind to reality. Remember, Richard, no matter how much you learn or how much you have, there'll always be a woman, and she can look at you. It took you so long to get here. Women are eternal, and I recognize fully what they are. And I think the time has come for us to get over the conflicts that have separated us. I think women, even today, may be rather hateful and revengeful towards the injustices that might have come their way. I didn't do that. And I don't think John Steinbeck was that way. He was a romantic idealist to his very last breath, and I suppose I am too. And I hope I did justice to him for all of you. Thank you very much.